There are 311 people in Coldwater Bend, and on the night the new schoolteacher asked me that question, every last one of them heard it. Not because she shouted. She didn't. She asked it soft, the way a person asks a thing they think is polite. But the town had spent 19 years arranging itself carefully around the shape of that silence, the way water arranges itself around a stone, and when she dropped the question into the middle of the church supper, the whole surface went still. I set down my fork. I remember that. I remember the sound it made against the tin plate and how loud it was. She was 24 years old. She had ink on her middle finger and a way of tilting her head when she listened, and she did not know, could not have known, that she just asked a man to explain a grave that nobody in that room would name out loud. I'm going to tell you what I told her, and I'm going to tell you the parts I didn't. The pie was peach, and it was going soft on the plate and I hadn't touched it. That's the detail I keep coming back to. 61 years old, and what my mind saved from that night wasn't her face or the silence or the way Reverend Halleck's hand froze halfway to his water glass. It was the pie. Peach, and it was sweating in the July heat, and the crust had gone the color of an old bruise where the juice had run. I count things, always have. My mother said it was a nervous habit and my father said it was a useful one, and they were both right, and neither of them lived long enough to see which one of them was more right. I count fence posts. I count the seconds between a horse's breaths when it's colicking. I counted the beams in the church hall that night 9 and the lanterns 6, and the number of people who were looking at me, all of them. Miss Adeline Rourke had been in Coldwater Bend 11 days. She'd come up from a normal school in Missouri with 2 trunks, a crate of books that took 4 men to carry, and a letter from a school board that had promised her a town with a schoolhouse. What she got was a schoolhouse with a hole in the roof and a stove that smoked, and she had said thank you and gotten to work. And inside of a week she'd had the older Kessler boys up on the roof with a bucket of tar, and she'd traded a hair comb to old Nettie Pike for a stovepipe brush, and she had not complained once, not where anyone could hear it. I'd liked her for that. I want to be honest about that, up front, because of what comes later. I liked her before she ever said a word to me. I liked her the way you like, whether that means well. She sat down across from me at the supper because it was the only seat left. That's all it was. There's no story in it. She sat down and she said, "Mr. Callum, isn't it?" And I said it was. And she said she'd heard I had the best water on the east side of the valley, and I said I had the only water on the east side of the valley, which is a different thing, and she laughed. It was a good laugh, unguarded, the kind that comes out before you've had time to decide whether it should. We talked about the well. We talked about the drought of '77 which she'd read about, which surprised me. We talked about a horse I'd sold to her landlord that had a habit of leaning on gates. And then, somewhere in the middle of all that easy nothing, she looked around the room at the families, the Kesslers with their 6, the Pikes with their 4, Deacon Boyd with his wife's hand on his shoulder, and she looked back at me and she said, "May I ask you something forward?" And I should have said no. I have gone over that moment more times than a man ought to go over anything. I've laid awake and walked it backward and stood myself at that fork and taken the other road, and in every version of it, I say no, ma'am, better not, and I pass her the salt, and she asks me about cattle prices instead, and the peach pie gets eaten and the lanterns get blown out, and the 19 years go on being 19 years. But I said go ahead. Because I liked her, because she'd fixed the roof, because it was July and I was tired and there was a part of me, small, buried, but there, that had been waiting 19 years for somebody to just ask, "Why have you never taken a wife?" That was it, that was the whole thing. She said it kindly. She wasn't fishing. She had that open look on her face that some young people have before life has taught them what a question can cost, the look that says surely there's a reason, and surely it's an ordinary one, and surely you'll tell me. And the room went quiet. Not all at once. That's not how it happens. It went quiet the way a fire goes out in stages, the flames dropping to embers dropping to smoke. Mrs. Kessler stopped mid-sentence with her mouth still open. Deacon Boyd's fork stopped. Somebody's chair creaked and then didn't creak again. Reverend Halleck's hand stopped halfway to his water glass and stayed there, and I watched it stay there, and I watched him realize it was staying there, and I watched him not be able to move it. 62 seconds, I counted. 62 seconds of 311 people. Well, 90 or so, that were in the hall deciding not to breathe. Miss Rourke's face went through three things very fast. First, it was still open. Then it was confused. Then it was afraid, and it was the last one that undid me because she wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid for me. She'd looked around and seen the room and worked out in that quick way she had that she'd stepped on something buried, and she was already reaching to pull her foot back, and there was nowhere to put it. "I'm sorry," she said, "that was." "It's all right." "No, Miss Rourke," I picked up my hat off the bench beside me, "it's all right." And I walked out. Here's what I want you to understand about Coldwater Bend, and I'm going to say it plain because there's no elegant way to say it. It is a town that built itself on top of a thing it did. Not all of them. That's not fair, and I won't say it. There were maybe 11 men involved, and maybe 30 who knew and said nothing, and the rest were women and children and old folks who understood only that there was a night in November of 1864 when the men went out and came back different, and that afterward you did not ask. And I was one of the 11. I was 14 years old. The walk from the church hall to my place is 2 miles, and I did it in the dark with no lantern because I know every rut and every root, and because I did not want to see my own hands. It was a warm night. Cicadas going in the cottonwoods down by the creek, that dry rattling sound that gets into your teeth. The smell of the sage after sundown, which is a smell I have loved my whole life, and which that night made me want to put my head down in the dirt. I got home. I lit the lamp. I sat down at the table where I have eaten every meal alone for 19 years, and I did not eat, and I did not sleep, and around 2 in the morning I got out the ledger. I keep logs, I said, I count things. It's the same sickness. Every day since I was 17 years old I have written down what happened. Weather, stock, water levels, what I did and what it cost. There are 44 volumes of it on the shelf behind me, and there is not one word of feeling in any of them, and that is on purpose, and I want you to know that I know it's on purpose. But I opened the current one and I wrote, July 19, hot, no rain, wind from the SW. And then I sat there with the pen, and I could not write the rest. Because the rest was, the new schoolteacher asked me why I never married, and I do not know how to tell her that I did. Her name was Naltsus. That's not the whole of it. Apache names aren't the kind of thing you carry off and hang on your wall, and I've never once said the whole of it out loud in the presence of a white man, and I'm not going to start now. But that was the part she gave me the first year, when I was 15 and she was maybe 16 and I was hiding in a wash with a broke leg, and she was the one who found me. She called me Nadin. It meant something like the one who counts. She thought it was funny. She'd caught me counting the ribs on a dead cow to keep my mind off the leg, and she'd laughed at me, and it was the first time in my life anyone had laughed at me in a way that didn't have teeth in it. I was 14 in November of '64. I turned 15 in the March after, and I met her in the June, and I want to be very precise about the order of those things because the order is the whole of it. I was one of the 11 men who rode out to the Chiricahua camp in November of 1864, and I met her in June of 1865. And I did not tell her, not for 6 years, not until I was 21 and she was 22, and we had been meeting in that wash and in the cottonwoods and in a stone hollow up on the ridge for 6 summers. And I had learned enough of her language to be embarrassing in it, and she had learned enough of mine to be devastating in it. And we had made every promise 2 people can make without a preacher. And I looked at her one afternoon in the shade with the light coming through the leaves, and I thought, she has to know. That's the morally heavy thing. I want to name it. People always want to know where the heavy decision was in a story like this, and they always guess wrong. They guess it was the raid. The raid wasn't a decision. I was 14 and my father put a rifle in my hands, and I did what I was told, and I have spent 47 years learning that I was 14 is an explanation and not an excuse, and that the difference between those two things is where a man lives. No, the decision was telling her. I could have not told her. That's the thing nobody understands. I could have carried it. I could have married her, and we would have had to leave. We knew that. We'd been planning it for 2 years. We had a place picked out west of the Rockies where nobody would know either of us. And I could have carried that stone in my chest until it killed me, and she would never have known, and she would have been happy. I sat in the wash on the 17th of August, 1871, and I chose to hand her the knife. She didn't say anything for a long time. That's what I remember. That's the thing that broke me, and it's still the thing that breaks me, that she didn't shout, she didn't strike me, she didn't stand up and walk into the brush and never come back, she just sat there. She had a way of holding her hands when she was thinking, left thumb pressed into the middle of the right palm, hard, like she was trying to push a splinter out from underneath. She did that for what felt like a year. And then she said, in English, which she almost never used with me, which she used only when she wanted a thing to land somewhere it couldn't be misremembered. She said, which one was my mother? And I told her. Because she asked. Because she deserved the whole of it or none of it. Because I had already chosen in that one worst moment to be a man who told the truth, and there is no partway down that road. I told her. She got up. She walked to the edge of the wash. She stood there with her back to me, and the wind was moving the grass, and I sat in the dirt, and I counted, God help me. I counted. I could not stop. 304 seconds. And then she came back and she sat down and she said, in Apache, you were a boy. And I said, I was there. And she said, yes. And that was all. That was the whole conversation. You were a boy, I was there. Yes. We sat in that wash until the light went out of it. I want to say she left me. It would be simpler. It would make me the villain, which is comfortable, and it would make her free, which is a kindness I could live with. She didn't leave me. She stayed. God forgive us both, she stayed, and we went on for another 4 years, and I do not have a word for what those 4 years were. They were not happiness. They were not happiness. They were two people holding something that was too heavy for either of them alone, holding it together, and finding. And this is the part I have never been able to say to anyone, that it was lighter that way. She said to me once in the 4th year, I have decided you are 2 men. And I said, that's not how it works. And she said, it is if I say so. She had a stubbornness in her that I have never seen the equal of. Not stubbornness the way a mule is stubborn. She wasn't stupid about it. She gave ground when there was ground to give. But there were 3 or 4 things in the world she had planted her feet on, and one of them was me. And once she had decided a thing, she would go through a mountain rather than around it. She was the one who decided we'd go west. She was the one who found the family in Sonora who'd take us in. She was the one who, when I said they'll never accept us, said, then we will not need them. She was the one who was still saying it in the winter of 1875, when the fever came through. 19 years. 19 years and 8 months and some days. I buried her myself. On the ridge, in the stone hollow, in the place where we'd well. In a place. I buried her with my own hands, and I did not tell one living soul, and I came down off that ridge, and I went into town, and I bought flour and coffee, and I said good morning to Reverend Halleck, and I went home. And I have been going home ever since. Here's what the town knows. The town knows that Silas Callum was 14 in November of '64, and that he rode out with the men, and that he came back, and that he has never once in 47 years spoken about it. The town knows that Silas Callum went strange after, kept to himself, wouldn't go to socials, wouldn't court. The town knows, and this is the part that took me a long while to understand, Because I'm slow about people. The town knows that if you don't ask Silas Callum why he never married, then Silas Callum doesn't have to say anything. And if Silas Callum doesn't have to say anything, then nobody has to remember what else happened in November of '64. They weren't protecting me. I thought they were, for years. I thought it was a kindness. I sat in that church every Sunday for 19 years thinking they were being gentle with me, and it took a 24-year-old girl from Missouri with ink on her finger and a hole in her roof to make me see it. They were using me. I was the lid they'd put on the thing. Every time somebody's grandson asked what happened in '64, Grandpa, the old man could look across the hall at the strange bachelor who never spoke and say, "Ask Silas," and the boy would look at me and see something in my face that made him stop asking, and that was the end of it for another generation. I was the silence. I had been the silence for 19 years, and I had thought I was the one keeping it. She came to the ranch on the third day. I'd been expecting somebody. I'd been expecting Reverend Halleck, actually, coming out to smooth it over, coming out to say she meant no harm and will speak to her, and no need to trouble yourself, Silas, which is what he'd said in '81 when a drummer passing through had asked one question too many at the store. It wasn't Halleck. It was Adeline Rourke in a borrowed buggy with a horse she didn't know how to handle, coming up my road at 11 in the morning with her hat crooked and her jaw set, and I stood on my porch and watched her come and I thought, she's going to apologize. She got down. She tied the horse badly. She walked up to my porch and she stopped at the bottom of the steps and she looked up at me and she said, "I'm not sorry." I didn't say anything. "I've been told to be sorry," she said, "by 4 separate people. Mrs. Kessler came to the schoolhouse. She brought a pie. She wanted me to understand that there are things we don't discuss in Coldwater Bend and that I'd been very rude and that if I'd only asked someone first." She stopped. Her hands were shaking. She was furious and she was 24 and she had not yet learned how to be furious quietly. I asked her what the things were that we don't discuss. And she left the pie. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "There's coffee." She sat at my table, the same table. She had a way of looking at a room. I'd seen her do it at the church hall where she'd take it all in at once and you could watch her filing it. 44 ledgers on the shelf, 1 plate on the drying rack, 1 cup, 1 chair with the seat worn down and 3 chairs without. "You count things," she said. "How do you know that?" "The fence." She nodded out toward the west line. "Every 10th post is painted. Nobody does that unless they're keeping track of something." I poured the coffee. My hands were steady. I want that on the record because everything else about me that morning was not. "Mr. Callum," she said, "I want to be clear that I'm not here to make you tell me anything." "Then why are you here?" And she said, and she was so young, and she was so sure, and I have loved her for it every day since. She said, because 62 seconds is a very long time for a room to be quiet, and I have been a teacher for 11 days and a person for 24 years, and I know the sound of a town that's afraid of a child asking the wrong question, and I have 31 children in that schoolhouse. She set her cup down. I need to know what I'm not supposed to teach them. The cicadas started up outside. Middle of the day and they were going already. It was going to be a scorcher. I sat down across from her. I put my hands flat on the table, both of them, and I looked at them. An old man's hands now, sun-cured. The left one crooked at the little finger where a colt broke it in '89. And I thought about a girl pressing her thumb into her palm like she was pushing out a splinter. "You were a boy." "I was there." "Yes." "Miss Rourke," I said, "before I answer you, I need you to understand something. If I say this out loud in this room to you, it doesn't stay in this room. You'll carry it. You'll carry it into that schoolhouse, and you'll carry it to the store, and you'll carry it to church on Sunday, and you will not be able to put it down. Not ever." "I know." "You don't." "Then tell me," she said, "and I will." And outside the window, the wind came up off the flat and moved through the cottonwoods, and it made that sound they make, that dry, rushing sound like water that isn't there. And I have heard that sound my whole life, and I have never once been able to hear it without thinking of a wash in June, and a girl laughing at me for counting the ribs on a dead cow. I opened my mouth. I counted to 4. And I said her name was. I said her name. The whole of it. The part I'd never given a white man and the part I'd never given anyone at all, 47 years of it sitting behind my teeth. And I said it in an Apache that had gone rusty and thick in my mouth from disuse, and it came out wrong, and I said it again, and the second time it came out right. Adeline Rourke did not move. She sat with her hands around a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking, and she did not move, and she did not make a sound. And I understood then that she was doing the hardest thing a listener can do, which is to get out of the way. So I got out of the way too. I told her about the wash. June of '65. I'd gone out after a heifer that had wandered off the flat, and I'd taken a shortcut down a cut bank, and the bank had come apart under the horse, and the horse had come down on top of me. And when I woke up, the horse was gone, and my left leg was bent in a place legs don't bend, and I was 7 miles from anything. I'd been there a day and a night. I dragged myself into the shade of the cut, and I'd found a dead cow, 3 months dead, dry as paper, nothing left of it but the hide going gray over the frame, and I had been lying in the sand next to it counting its ribs. Over and over. Left to right to left. Because the leg was screaming, and because I was 15, and because if I stopped counting I was going to start crying, and I had been raised in a house where that was a thing you did not do. 26. That's the number. A cow has 26 ribs, 13 a side, and I had counted them 400 and some times, and I was still counting them when a shadow came across the sand. She laughed at me, I said. Adeline didn't say anything. I want you to understand. I had a rifle. It was under the horse, but she didn't know that. I was a white boy with a broke leg in a wash 7 miles from town in June of 1865, and she stood up on that bank and looked down at me, and she saw what I was, and I saw what she was, and there was about 2 seconds where the whole thing could have gone the other way. What happened in those 2 seconds? I said 26. She blinked. That's all I said. I was so far gone I didn't have anything else in my head. She's standing up there, and I look up at her and I say 26, and I point at the cow. I turned my hand over on the table, and she laughed. She was 16. She had come down that wash on her own, which she was not supposed to do, and she'd come down it because there was a plant that grew in the wet sand at the bottom that her grandmother wanted, and there was nowhere else within a day's ride to get it, and she had a bundle of it under her arm when she found me. She looked at the leg. She looked at me. She said something I didn't understand, and I said something she didn't understand, and we sat there in the sand, the two of us and a dead cow, in the middle of a country where our people had been killing each other for 2 generations, and she splinted my leg with the bank willow. That's it. That's the whole beginning. She could have walked away. She could have gone up that bank and gone home and told nobody, and I'd have died in that wash, and there'd have been no story and no 19 years and no 62 seconds of silence in a church hall. I asked her about it years later, why she stopped. She said, "You were counting." I said, "That's not a reason." And she said, "I have never seen a man do a thing so useless." I wanted to know why. Adeline was crying. Not hard, not the way you'd think. Just sitting there very upright with the tears coming down and her face not moving at all, like the crying was happening to somebody else and she was waiting politely for it to finish. "Miss Rourke." "Keep going," she said. I told her about the 6 years. I told her how it started as nothing, how I'd gone back to that wash a month later with my leg still stiff, not because I expected anything, but because I'd left my hat and I was 15 and my mother would tan me for losing a hat, and how the hat was there, set up on a rock, weighted with a stone against the wind. and how there was a thing next to it, a little braided thing of grass, which I did not understand and which I put in my pocket and which I carried for 30 years until it came apart. I told her how I went back, and how the third time she was there. I told her about the language, how we built it, piece by piece, out of nothing, out of pointing and drawing in the dirt and repeating things wrong until they came out right. How she learned faster than I did always, and how it made me furious, and how she knew it made me furious and did it on purpose. I told her about the summer she taught me to sit still, which sounds like nothing, which was the hardest thing anyone has ever taught me. She'd made me sit at the top of the ridge and not count anything for the length of an afternoon, and I'd nearly come out of my skin, and she'd sat next to me and not said one word for 4 hours, and at the end of it I'd said, "What was that for?" And she'd said, "Now you know what my life is like when you are talking." I laughed telling it. First time I'd laughed in that house in longer than I could reckon, and it came out of me strange, cracked, like a hinge that's rusted. Adeline laughed too, wetly. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist and it left a smear of ink there from her finger, and she didn't notice and I did not tell her. And then I told her about August of '71. I told it slow. I told it exactly. I did not soften one word of it because I had softened it in my own head for 40 years and I had learned what softening does. It doesn't make the thing lighter, it just makes it shapeless, and a shapeless thing you can't put down because you can't get hold of it. I told her I was 14. It was November. There'd been a raid on the Purcell place and 2 men killed, and my father came home and got the rifle down off the pegs, and there were 11 of them on the porch, and one of them said the boy comes, and my father said nothing, and that was the whole of my consent. I told her it was not the people who'd raided the Purcell place. We knew that. Some of us knew it before we rode, and all of us knew it before we got there, and none of us said it, and I have thought a long time about which of those is worse. I told her I was 14 and I fired my rifle and I do not know what I hit. That's the truth. That is the exact and complete truth, and I have never been able to improve on it. I don't know. There was so much noise and so much smoke and I was so afraid and I fired and I don't know. And then I told her what her mother's name was, because that is what I had told the girl in the wash, and I was not going to tell this one less. Adeline put her head down on my table. She put her forehead on the wood and her arms over her head, and she stayed like that, and her back was shaking, and I sat there across from her with my hands flat on the table, and I did not touch her and I did not speak. Because there is nothing to say. I learned that in a wash in 1871. There is nothing you can say to a person you have handed a stone like that. All you can do is sit with them while they figure out whether they can carry it, and you do not get to help, and you do not get to hurry them. Cicadas outside. The clock on the shelf that I've never wound in 19 years, sitting there stopped at 4:20 like it had been the day she died. After a long while she sat up. Her face was ruined. She didn't try to fix it. She stayed, she said. Yes. Why? And I said, I have been asking that for 40 years and I do not have an answer. You must. I've got guesses. Then guess. Here's my guess. I've never said it out loud. I think she stayed because she was the only person on either side of that valley who had decided, deliberately, with her eyes open, having heard the worst thing there was to hear, that a man was not the same as the worst thing he had done. And I think she did it not for me. I think she did it for herself. Because she had watched her people become the worst thing that was done to them. She had watched it hollow them out. She had grandmothers who could not say a name and cousins who could not sleep and a whole world that was turning into nothing but a list of what was taken, and she looked at all that and she said no. Not out loud. Not to anybody. She just refused. She refused to let a thing that had been done to her decide what she was. And I was the proof. I was the hardest possible case. I was the worst thing in the world, sitting in a wash with a broke leg counting the ribs on a cow, and if she could hold me, If she could look at me and still find something worth keeping, then she was free. Then nothing they had done to her got to own her. She told me once, "You are my stubbornness." I thought it was a joke. It took me 30 years to understand it wasn't. Adeline was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You've made her into a saint." I looked at her. "I'm sorry," she said, "but you have, and I don't think she'd like it." And something in my chest went hot, and I opened my mouth to tell that girl she had no right, that she had known this woman for the length of one telling, that she had no. And I stopped, because she was right. She was 24 years old with ink on her face, and she had listened to me for 3 hours, and she had heard the thing I could not hear, which was that I had spent 19 years polishing a woman into something that could not hurt me anymore. I had made her patient. I had made her wise. I had made her forgiving, and every year the memory got a little smoother, and I had never once let myself remember. "She hit me," I said. Adeline's head came up. In the wash, in 71, when I told her, my voice was doing something I couldn't control. She sat there and she didn't say anything, and then she got up and she walked to the edge of the wash and she stood there, and then she came back and she said, "You were a boy," and I said I was there, and she said yes, and then she hit me across the face with the flat of her hand as hard as she could, and I let her, and she did it again and I let her, and she did it a third time and she broke a tooth loose, and I still have the gap and I let her. I put my hand over my mouth. And then she sat down and she put her head against my chest and she cried until she couldn't, and I held her, and we did not speak for the rest of the day, and that is what happened, I said. And I have not been able to remember that in 19 years. Adeline Rourke reached across my table and took my hand. "I want to tell you," I pulled away. 61 years old, a man who has not been touched in 19 years except by horses and by the barber, and a young woman I've known 11 days puts her hand on mine. I did not pull away. I held onto it like a drowning man, and I put my head down and I made a sound I have never made in front of another living person, and she held on, and she did not say it's all right, because it was not, and she knew it was not, and she was the first person in 47 years who did not try to tell me otherwise. "Sometime past 4, she said, "the town knows." It wasn't a question, but I answered it. "They know about November," I said. "Everybody over 50 knows about November. They know about her." I shook my head. "No, that they don't." "Mr. Callum." She had gotten hold of herself. She had that look again, that filing look, and I watched her put it all together in front of me, and I felt something cold start up in my stomach. "You met a woman in a wash 7 miles from a town of 300 people. You went out to meet her for 25 years. You have a ridge on your land with a stone hollow on it that you have never once let a hired man go up to," I asked. "By the way, I asked Tom Kessler what was up on your ridge, and he went the color of a fish and changed the subject. You stopped a clock." I didn't say anything. "They know," she said. "Not all of them, but some of them. And they have known for a long time, and they have said nothing, and I want you to think very hard about why." I thought about it that night. I thought about it all that night. I sat at the table with the lamp burning down and the moths coming in through the screen, and I thought about Reverend Halleck, who'd been a boy of 9 in November of 64, and who had never once, in 30 years of Sunday mornings, asked me to speak in front of the congregation. I thought about Nettie Pike, who had brought a basket of something to my gate in the spring of 1876, 4 months after the fever, and left it and gone away without knocking, and I had thought at the time it was a strange kindness and had never asked why. I thought about Tom Kessler going the color of a fish. They knew. Not the details. Not her name, not the wash, not the ridge. But they knew there was a shape out there on the east side of the valley, some shape in the life of Silas Callum that did not fit the town's idea of itself, and they had decided, the way a town decides things, which is not by deciding but by not deciding over and over for years, that it was better not to look. And I had let them. That's the thing that kept me at that table until the lamp went out. Not what they'd done, what I'd done. Because I could have said her name, any year, any Sunday. I could have stood up in that church and said I loved an Apache woman for 25 years and she is buried on my ridge and her name was. And I didn't. I told myself it was to protect her, even after she was dead, especially after she was dead. But that's not the whole of it, and I knew it, sitting there in the dark with the moths. Some of it, and I will not tell you how much because I don't know and I have been afraid to find out. Some of it was that as long as I said nothing, I got to be the town's strange, quiet bachelor. And that is a small pain, and it is a survivable pain. And the other thing I could have been was the man who did what I did in November of 1864. I chose the small pain. For 19 years, I chose the small pain, and I let them use my silence as a lid. And every boy in that valley who ever asked his grandfather what happened in '64 got looked at and got quiet and grew up and had a boy of his own who asked. And the whole thing rolled forward, and I was the reason. She came back on Saturday. I'd known she would. What I hadn't known was that she'd come back angry. She got down off that buggy and she didn't tie the horse at all. Just dropped the lines and came up the steps 2 at a time. And she had a paper in her hand and her face was white. Do you know what they're teaching? Miss Rourke. Do you know what is in the curriculum, Mr. Callum? She slapped the paper down on my porch rail. The school board gave me this. It is what I'm to teach in the fall term. Local history, founding of Coldwater Bend. Her hand was shaking. There's a paragraph about 1864. Do you want to know what it says? No. It says there was an incident. She was almost laughing, and there was nothing good in it. It says the settlers acted to secure the valley. It says 4 words about it, and one of them is regrettable, and I am to read it aloud to 31 children, including a 9-year-old girl named Hattie Boyd, whose great-grandfather. Adeline. She stopped. It was the first time I'd used her name. They're not asking you to lie, I said quietly. That's what you've got wrong. They know it's true. They all know it's true. They're asking you to say it in a way that lets everyone keep on being who they think they are, and that is a different thing, and it is worse. And if you go into that meeting on Monday and tell them they're liars, they will smile at you and nod, and you will be on a train in October, and there will be a new teacher in November who reads the paragraph. She stared at me. So what do I do? And that is the question. That is the whole question. And it took a 14-year-old boy 47 years and a schoolteacher 3 days to bring me to it. And I stood on my own porch in the July heat, and I heard myself say, "You don't do anything. Mr. Callum." "I do it." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said very carefully, "Do what?" And I looked out at the west line, at the fence, at every 10th post painted white. 410 posts I could tell you the count of without thinking. And I looked past it at the ridge going brown in the drought, and the stone hollow up there where the ground had settled a little in 19 years. The way ground does, so that if you knew what you were looking at you could see the shape of it. "There's a town meeting Monday," I said, "for the school board." "Yes." "Public." "Yes." I put my hat on. "Then I reckon I'll come." She stood there on my porch in the sun and she said, "Sela's." First and last time she ever used mine. "They will destroy you." And I thought about a girl in a wash pressing her thumb into her palm like she was pushing out a splinter, and about how she'd looked when she'd said, "I have decided you are 2 men," and about how I'd said that's not how it works, and how she'd said, "Maybe," I said. "Then why?" I couldn't answer her. I stood there a long time trying and I could not get it into words, and finally I just said, "It's Monday, that's all. It's Monday." Which is not an answer, which is the worst answer a man ever gave. But she looked at my face and something in her went quiet, and she picked up her paper off the rail, and she nodded once, and she went down the steps and got in her buggy. And she'd got halfway down the road before I realized what I should have said, which was, because she stayed. Because she looked at the worst thing there was and she stayed. And I have spent 19 years being grateful for it, and not one single day being worthy of it. And I am 61 years old, and Monday is the last chance I am going to get. I didn't say it. I stood on the porch and watched the dust go up off her wheels, and I didn't say it. I never did say it. That's what I understood, standing in the doorway with my hat in my hands. Word had gone around the way it goes around in a place like that, not by telling exactly, but by a look past at the store, by somebody's wife saying, "I hear Sheila's Callum's coming Monday," in a tone that meant something, by the whole town's nervous system firing at once, and they had come. 70 people, I counted, 71 with the Reverend. Nettie Pike was there, and she was 84 years old, and she had not been out of her house since Christmas. Adeline was up front with the board, 3 men at a table, Deacon Boyd, Amos Thurgood who ran the store, and Halleck. She had her hands folded on the table in front of her, and she was so straight-backed she looked like she'd been nailed to the chair, and when I came in she didn't look at me. That was deliberate. She was smarter than I was about nearly everything. I sat in the back. The meeting started. There was business first. There's always business first. That's how a town keeps from having to get to the thing. Stovepipe. The roof. Whether the Kessler boys should be paid for the tar or whether it was Christian charity, which took 11 minutes. A discussion of readers and whether the new ones were too dear. I sat there with my hat on my knee, and I counted the beams, and I counted the lanterns, and I counted my own pulse, which I have never done before and do not recommend. And then Amos Thurgood cleared his throat and said, "Miss Rourke has raised a question about the local history portion." And the room changed. She did it well. God, she did it well. She did not say lies, and she did not say massacre, and she did not say one word that would let them dismiss her as an outsider with a temperament. She stood up with the paper in her hand, and she said that she'd been asked to teach a paragraph about 1864, and that she did not feel competent to teach it, and that before she could stand in front of 31 children and tell them what had happened in their valley, she needed the board to tell her what had happened in their valley. "That's all," she said. "I'm asking to be taught." It was beautiful. It was a knife with a ribbon on it. Deacon Boyd said the paragraph was sufficient. Thurgood said the school board had approved it in 1889 and saw no cause to revisit. Halleck said nothing at all. And Adeline said, "Then I'll teach it as written, and when a child raises her hand and asks me what incident means, I'll tell her to ask her grandfather." Somebody in the third row made a noise. "And I'll tell her," she said, "to keep asking until she gets an answer." Boyd stood up. I stood up. I don't remember getting to my feet. That's the honest truth of it. I remember sitting and I remember standing, and there is nothing in between, and I have never been able to put it back together. The room went round to look at me. 70 faces, 71. And I want to tell you I was calm. I want to tell you that a man who has carried a thing for 47 years sets it down with dignity. I was shaking so hard, I had to put my hand on the back of the chair in front of me. "My name is Sheila's Callum," I said. And the sound of my own voice in that room nearly finished me, because it was small, it was so small, and I had actually thought, walking up that road, that it would come out of me like a river. Most of you know that. Nobody moved. "I was 14 years old in November of 1864, I said, "and I rode out with the men to the camp on Buck Creek, and I fired my rifle, and I do not know what I hit." Reverend Halleck closed his eyes. "That's what I saw. Out of 71 people, that's what my eye caught and held on to, a man of 55 sitting at that table with his hands folded, closing his eyes, the way you do when a thing you have been dreading for 30 years finally arrives, and there is a kind of terrible rest in it. There were 11 of us, I said. I'm the last one living. Ede Purcell went in '03 and Harlan Boyd went in '07. Deacon Boyd's head came up. And I have been the last one for 9 years and I have said nothing. And the reason I have said nothing is not the reason you think. The hall was so quiet I could hear the lantern flames. It was not the raiders, I said. The camp on Buck Creek did not raid the Purcell place. We knew that before we rode. Some of us said so. My father said so on the porch, and then he got his rifle down anyway, and I have spent 47 years trying to understand that, and I cannot, and I never will, and I want the record of this town to say that we knew. Somebody was crying, a woman, I didn't look to see who. There were 51 people in that camp. 19 of them were men. I stopped. I had rehearsed the next part. I had walked my fence line Sunday and rehearsed it out loud to 410 posts, and I had it word perfect, and it went out of my head like water out of a broke jug. So I said something else instead. In June of the year after, I said, I broke my leg in a washout past the East Flat, and a girl of 16 came down the bank and splinted it with willow and saved my life. She was Chiricahua. Her mother was killed on Buck Creek in November of 1864, and I was there and she knew it, because I told her in August of 1871, and she stayed with me anyway. The whole hall went out from under me. I don't mean that as a figure. I mean the sound went, the small shifting sounds a room of people makes, the coughs and the chair creaks. It all stopped at once and did not come back, and it was so total that for a second I thought I'd gone deaf. We were together 25 years, I said. She died of the fever in the winter of '75. She is buried on my ridge, and she has been buried there for 19 years, and every one of you who thought you were being kind to me by not asking, you were not being kind to me. You were keeping her in the ground twice. I had to stop. I stood there in the back of the church hall with my hand on a chair, and I could not go on, and nobody helped me, and I did not want them to. Then I said, her name was, and I said it, the whole of it, in the room, in front of 71 people and God and the 6 lanterns, and my mouth had gone so dry it came out cracked, and I did not care, and it went out into that hall and hung there. And then I picked up my hat and I walked out. Nobody followed me. That's the part they never believe when I've told it since, and I've told it 3 times in 19 years, or I suppose it's 20 now or more. Nobody followed. Not Adeline. Not Halleck. I walked out of that hall into the dark, and I stood in the road, and the cicadas were going in the cottonwoods, and I could hear, through the wall, absolutely nothing. 71 people not saying anything. I walked home, 2 miles, no lantern. I'd like to tell you the town changed. I've read the kind of story where it does, where the old man speaks and the scales fall and they come out to the ridge with their hats off, and there's a stone cut and a hymn sung, and somebody's grandson shakes your hand. Here is what actually happened. Nothing happened for 11 days. 11 days of the store being polite to me. 11 days of people finding somewhere else to look. 11 days of my hired man, Roy, who is not a talker, being so relentlessly, aggressively normal at me that I understood he had made a decision about it and was going to see it through, and I was more grateful to that man than I have ever been able to say. Then Amos Thurgood came out to the ranch. He stood at my gate, he wouldn't come up. He was 68 and his father had been one of the 11, and he stood at my gate turning his hat around in his hands, and he said, my father told me, in '91, when he was dying. I waited. He told me, and then he said not to tell my boys. Thurgood looked at the ridge. He looked at it for a long time. I never did. No. I got 4 grandsons, he said. And then he put his hat on and got back in his wagon and drove away. And he did not say one thing more. And I have never in my life had a conversation that meant so much and contained so little. Reverend Halleck never spoke to me about it. Not once. Not until he died in 1907, And I sat in that church for 11 more years of Sundays, and he preached at me, and I looked at him, and he looked at me, and neither of us ever said a word. But in the fall of that same year, the fall of '94, he preached on Buck Creek. He didn't call it that. He preached on a text out of 2 Samuel about a famine that came because of a thing a king had done and buried, and how the land itself would not give until the bones were brought up and put in the ground properly. And he preached it badly. He stumbled twice, and he did not once look up from his notes. Nettie Pike wept in the second row. And afterward everybody walked out and had dinner and nobody said anything about it. And that is exactly, precisely, and completely what happened. And if you want more than that, then you want a different town than the one I live in. Adeline stayed. Not forever. 3 years. She married a surveyor out of Denver in '97 and went east, and I got a letter at Christmas for 11 years, and then the letters stopped. And I do not know if she died or forgot me, and I have chosen not to find out. But those 3 years. She rewrote the paragraph. Not the one in the curriculum. She couldn't touch that. The board wouldn't let her. And she was smart enough not to break herself against it. She wrote her own. She wrote it out by hand, and she read it to those children in the spring of 1895. And she did not ask permission. And half a dozen parents complained, and Deacon Boyd went to the board, and the board met for 2 hours and came out and said nothing at all. And she went on teaching. She never told me what was in it. I asked, she said, it's for them. I said, it's about her. And she said, and she was 27 by then, and something had settled in her face that hadn't been there before, and I have thought about it every year since. She said, it's about them, Silas. She's just the reason it's true. Hattie Boyd is a grown woman now. She teaches in Cheyenne. She wrote to me in 1911, out of nowhere, an envelope in a hand I didn't know, and she said she had been 9 years old in the schoolhouse in the spring of 1895, and that she remembered every word of what Miss Rourke read to them, and that she had been repeating it to children ever since. She asked if she could come out and see the ridge. I said yes. She came in June. She stood up there in the stone hollow with her hat in her hand, and she didn't cry, and she didn't pray, and she didn't say anything I could hear. And after a while she turned to me and she said, "Do you count?" I said, "What?" "Miss Rourke told us you count things." She had a plain, level way about her, that girl, Boyd's blood, and thank God for it. "Do you count the days?" And I said no. Which was a lie. 14,111 at that time. I have not stopped, and I am not going to. I am 78 years old. The clock on the shelf is still stopped at Fort Wentty. Roy's boy runs the place now, and he thinks I'm a mean old man, and he is not entirely wrong. There are 52 ledgers on the shelf, and there is still not one word of feeling in any of them. And I have decided at this late hour that that is not because I am cold, but because there is one book I have never written, and every other book has been the wall around it. They put a stone up in '09, not a big one. The town paid for it, which took 4 years of arguing, and which I did not ask for, and which I did not stop. It says her name. The whole of it. Spelled the way I told them and cut the way I told them, and there is not a word of English on it, and there is not a date, because I did not know the day she was born, and it never once occurred to either of us to ask. I go up on Sundays. I don't pray. I don't talk to her, whatever people think. I never have, I never could. It always seemed to me like a way of not admitting she was gone. I go up and I sit in the stone hollow, and I look out at the flat going gold in the evening, and the wind comes up off it and moves through the cottonwoods and makes that dry, rushing sound like water that isn't there. And I sit still. 4 hours sometimes, not counting anything. It's the only thing she ever taught me that I still can't do well. And I have been practicing for 51 years, and I think about her sitting next to me in that heat with her mouth shut and her eyes closed, and how she never once told me I was getting better at it. She just kept sitting there.